So I'm presenting today, Show Me the Money, an examination of financial variables at publicly funded four-year, I put in parentheses, regional universities, but the sample set does go a little bit beyond that. So I am Dr. Alice Daughtery with the University of Alabama. I am an Associate Dean of Collections and Technical Services, and at the moment I'm also an Interim Dean for Research and User Services, which is the instruction and access services arm of the university. That's only going to be a temporary hat. I did this presentation with my dean, Dr. Donald Gilstrap, obviously also from the University of Alabama. I'm going to mix a little bit today about some higher education thoughts and then some financial variables that he and I have been analyzing over the last couple of months. And I would really be curious about some of your questions, perhaps after the presentation, or any thoughts or comments you might have post-conference. So just to let you know a little about myself, I, to the best of my knowledge, am a first-generation college graduate. My mother worked for the airlines in the 60s. She was a senior flight attendant, and my father did his education on the front lines of Vietnam. I'm a Pell recipient, and I paid every penny of my undergraduate education on my own, working odd jobs, summer jobs, Christmas jobs, whenever you could get a job, and a couple student loans, right? So I just kind of want to set the foundation there for the type of student that I was. Before I go too far, the obligatory code of conduct. Now this work, I want to mention that it is a work in progress. So I might not have all the answers or the data that you're hoping for. I might not even present what you're hoping for. And then when we do get into the data, I'm just going to be very raw and honest to you. They are not pretty slides. And by pretty, there's no real data viz. I just kind of put the data out there, and we're just going to have a couple conversations about what it's really telling you. By saying it's a work in progress, when I was trying to run some regression analysis, I just couldn't get the data to fit the model. So I continued to change the data set a little. Later, if I have time, I can talk to you about some Pearson correlations that I found, but most of them are going to be what you would expect. Case in point, the library gets more money in their budget, the library spends more money on their collection. There's a really strong correlation to that relationship, right? So it's not anything profound, but it's at least something that could make it to print or in a research study if I go further with it. There's also going to be some other data in here that goes beyond just libraries. So some assumptions framing the talk. I have a lot of curiosity about the declining state investment, better known as the state disinvestment in higher education. So for my doctoral dissertation, I basically researched the 146 flagship universities across the United States in the private and publicly funded world. And over a 20-year span, you could see easily a decline in state appropriations. State appropriations, right? The funding that is given to the state so that they have a state university, which goes to the flagships or other publicly funded universities. So I think from 2012 to 2022, we saw at least a 30% decline in state appropriations. So why do I tell you that? Because I just want you to understand where some of your revenues are coming from. So if you don't have state appropriations, where does the cost shift? It shifts to tuition and fees. And we've seen an increase in tuition and fees, probably 2 to 4% inflationary, above the inflationary, over the years, right? And that's just kind of an average standard. So if it's not coming to the schools through state investment, then it's coming to the schools through tuition and fees. Well, that leaves us with another problem, student loan debt. Now, my figure is a little bit old in that I'm going to cite it from maybe a year and a half ago. Student loan debt is sitting at about $1.7 trillion in the United States. That's a lot of student loan debt that's shifting away from state appropriations. And of course, state budgets have to fund their mandatory funding, which is Medicaid and the elementary and secondary school funding systems. So higher ed is more of a entitlement, is what they refer to it. So it's not mandatory funding. Mandatory is Medicaid and the K through 12 system. So what else does this tell me? And maybe some of you know this if you work at regional schools. A lot of regional schools are in rural areas, right? And they serve a population that consists of high poverty. So regional schools, particularly HBCUs, that I'm going to focus on a little bit, affect high poverty areas and rural areas. And anything with high loan debt pushes those talented young rural students away because they need to go find work to pay off their debt. So they don't stay, and it becomes a circular issue. Some other assumptions. Library funding is weird. I actually was told that by a CBO of a university where they just didn't really understand what the library was funding or how it operated, why it didn't work like the other academic colleges. So that's why that's there, but I'm not giving you the specifics of who told me that, but it was a CBO of a major university. And then we know that libraries, in some schools, they're considered a college and a department. So we have this kind of unique relationship. And in that, we don't really generate a lot of revenue, right? We're not the same way as those that actually have students and can generate tuition and fees. Okay, so just quick through this. The data sources that I used, Carnegie, right? So I sliced the data using Carnegie, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, but I wanted you to at least see where I was getting it. And Carnegie redid their metrics in 2025, so I was trying to use older metrics. And then the other source, IPEDS. The IPEDS data is going to come from fiscal year 2023, and that might be the furthest that we have. Like, I didn't see any 2024 data, and I know that I should have followed up, but I think the survey is not being ported into IPEDS anymore, right? So you're going to have to so now we've lost our free access to data to study ourselves, because now you have to pay to get the data, whether, if it's an ACRL, right? Which we hope it's an ACRL, but then you have to pay and get permission because it's proprietary. Okay, so to help with the narrative of where we're all at, and as I said, most of you probably already know, your flagships are going to be your R1 or R2, your very large universities. They're really focusing on research, so the economic and community development aspect is global or national, because that's what they're pressing for. They're really bringing in those research grants, larger endowments, and they just compete on a much more expansive scale, right? Your regional schools, they focus in a geographic location. So economically, they're trying to improve that geographic expanse. Sometimes it might be on a state level or even a national level, but really the main focus is that pipeline that's within that geography. So you see a lot of regional schools that have nursing programs and other professional programs that stay within that community. Their focus is more on teaching and workforce development, And typically, outside of the HBCUs or those with the large loan debt, their talent pipeline stays within the region. And then community colleges, I just threw this in here so you could see the 3 different layers. Community colleges focus more on vocational training and transfer pathways, so a more affordable path to education. They also are very keen to have rapid reskilling when jobs change, and they can help train up new talent and work with industry for building economic growth. So the data that I pulled, Carnegie gave me about 4,000 different institutions that I had to go through. This included publicly funded, private not-for-profit, and private for-profit. That's what that little acronym stands for. It also gave me some institutional classifications, to which the HBCUs sat within 11 of those institutional classifications. I don't have a slide of those 11, but that's how I culled the data further down. Like, I only wanted schools that matched the same institutional classifications as the HBCUs. IPEDS recognizes 102 HBCUs in the nation. Carnegie recognizes a different number, so it's important to understand that where you pull your data set depends on how they classify and list things. And then I also have some Hispanic serving institutions in here that I'm going to talk about. I want you to also just kind of put a pin in the idea that the Hispanic serving institutions are designated that way because more than 25% of their population identifies that way. That is not the case for the HBCUs, though, which of course were basically congressionally established with the Second Morrill Act years and years and years ago in the late 1800s or later, right? So you kind of have 2 different reasons for how these institutions came about. When I talk about the HBCUs today, and it's mentioned up here, I'm basically talking about 38 regionals. They're in 19 states, mostly in the South or in the Mid-Atlantic region. These schools, half of these schools are in what I would consider the Deep South states. And I don't mean that as a pejorative at all, as more just a truthful fact. So you're talking Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina. 5 of those 6 schools are within the top 10 poorest states. So 5 of those states are within the top 10 poorest states of the nation. That's where a majority of these HBCUs are sitting. And the 6th state is within the 15th poorest state. So sorry for converting school and state, but it's important to know because it's going to play out in the data, right? And then it's going to play out in how those libraries operate. So I'm not just sending you on a wild goose chase here. I was doing quartile data in SPSS. It doesn't really give you a nice graphic. So quartile data, when you graph it, will look like this. It's a box and whisker plot. What that's going to tell you, and I have another representation so you can wrap your mind around it, because I know I work with librarians, right? And data and math, you know, we want to just be gentle when we introduce those concepts, right? So what that's basically telling you is we're going to talk about the lower quartile, so the lower grouping of 25, and then the mean or the median, which is going to get you to that middle ground, and then after the 75. So you kind of have this, like, better graphic, a bell chart, right? So maybe this makes more sense for you. You know, you can see where the different colors are, where we're going to talk about the first 25, and then up to the 50 mark, and then 75 and above, right? So that's how I've split the data that we're going to look at in a little bit. And I just want you to know how that plays out, right? I didn't put it in a bell chart. I didn't put it in a box and whisker chart. I'm just going to kind of give it to you almost like Excel, but not quite. So when we start talking about the library budget, IPEDS breaks it down. And for those of you that have submitted IPEDS data or gone to an assessment conference, IPEDS breaks the library budget down into 3 major components. And those components, of course, are operations, personnel, and acquisitions. Now, we could maybe use some different words there, but it's pretty standard, right? So operations is going to be anything like professional development, needing new computers, maybe paying for an ILS system or a bibliographic system, right? Personnel, it's the human capital. It's the talent that you bring on board at whatever level that you're paying. And then acquisitions is everything you're paying toward your collections budget. Okay. I did cite some of this in my research, so I just thought I would go through, and I'm not one to really like to read slides, but I thought it was important to at least give you an opportunity to read those issues. And you can see I'm citing literature from 30 years ago. So we're still dealing, like, do you still feel the same way? It's almost 40 years ago now. You know, these things are still relevant in our world. I do want to say that like libraries operate under the umbrella of their parent institution, and their collection size and their budget, they're directly related to the degree of importance that's placed on them by that parent institution, right? And even though libraries cater to collections and services all across their campus communities, they still have formidable opponents when it comes to resource allocation, financial resource allocation, right? It's tricky. It's tricky to get those budget numbers. I love Thalen's statement that it's the most philosophical, the budget's the most philosophical statement about institutional priorities. In colloquial terms, you get what you pay for. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the data. This is, again, I'm just looking at expenditures per FTE, so full-time equivalent. This particular data point I did not calculate out, and I almost wish I had, because I do wonder how these numbers were derived. But this is actually a data point within IPEDS that you can pull certain years of data. And of course, this is 2023 data, so it's in 2023 dollars, right? I didn't convert it to 2025. And then throughout the slides, we're going to keep that same look. The all regionals, I didn't just pull out predominantly white. When I say all regionals, it's factoring in the HSIs and the HBCUs. Because again, it's a work in progress, and I was just playing with the data and kind of trying to see where it was going to get me. But I thought these were pretty decent. They're not too far off. The all regionals aren't too far off in what you would see with the flagships. Where you'll really see the difference is if you go over to private universities, right? They're going to be a whole lot more. And now we're just going to break it through the 3 pieces of the core budget, right? Operations, personnel, and materials. So library operating, you can see that now you're seeing a big difference between the HBCUs and the Hispanic serving institutions. So I mentioned earlier, the HBCUs are sitting in the Deep South, 5 of the poorest states. And now you're seeing it, because where do you think the Hispanic serving institutions are? California and Texas, I heard someone say it. That's exactly where they are, right? Yeah, little in Florida as well. So you're starting to see the funding kind of play out and the differences and the challenges that those schools will have in their operating budget, because I don't imagine that very many of them have a lot of travel. And so, you have to kind of wonder where their advocacy is and other things that factor into financial variables. So we can also talk about their salary expenditures. Again, the salary expenditures of the Hispanic serving institutions, it's even higher, it's double than the average, right? So when you're running it, and keep in mind that all regionals, even though I classified it as that, there's a few flagships in there, right? The data was a little messy, and I'm not going to pretend that it's just 100% regionals because I was trying to expand the sample set because I didn't want curvilinear regression. But so even with some flagships there, you're still seeing where the HSIs are double the average in the 75th percentile and above. And then total material expenditures. So this is your total amount that's expended to your acquisitions, right? This would include your one-time purchases, everything, as it is reported. So all of this data, the caveat is, as it is reported. Again, pretty remarkable. When I think about HBCUs, and I don't know a whole lot about them, so I don't want to misspeak, but it does make me wonder, when we think of equity in libraries and equality, are we doing them a disservice by not having them in certain consortium where they can negotiate and have other people at the table that help get them a better deal, right? I think of the state of Alabama and the role the University of Alabama plays in negotiating, and how I've partnered with regional universities to ensure that large deal contracts, whether it's Elsevier, Wiley, Sage, Springer Nature, that we're bringing them on board, right? Like if I move up the ladder, I'm bringing them up the ladder with me. So if I get a 2% inflation rate, they better get a 2% inflation rate too. And so are we incorporating some of our other regional universities or HBCUs into those consortium models? And I don't know, I would have to dig a little deeper. That's why I say some of it's a work in progress. I know that they, for interlibrary loan, have their own network, but we might see how that plays out with interlibrary loan services as well, because maybe they don't have access to Rapid, or maybe they don't have as much access to Rapido, or maybe they don't have access to those major consortiums where they can do document delivery. I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying I'm just posing the question, because these are things I think about. Since I mentioned interlibrary loan, let's talk about a little lending. I gave a pipe, so hopefully this makes sense. Lending is on the left, borrowing is on the right of the pipe. So you can kind of see that they're not even doing much, HBCUs, in lending or borrowing, right? It's a really small number. It just makes me wonder why. Why is the number small? And what do they need? And how can we serve them better? Or how can we serve regionals in general better? And then I'm going to go through quickly just some university side data. University operating revenues, these are your core revenues as defined in IPEDS. So it's going to be your tuition and fees, your state, local, federal appropriations, state, local, and federal grants, and sales and auxiliary for anybody who may have, I'm not saying a regional has a hospital, but any of those type of larger sales and auxiliary sales. So that's your university operating revenues and the differences. Again, you can see how being placed in a location such as California and Texas versus the rural South really affects how the regionals play out. I imagine if I dug a little deeper, any type of rural geolocation for any regional would affect where its operating revenues come from. And then this was just semester tuition and fees for undergrad. Just clarifying that. I didn't calculate it out based on FTE, it's just semester based. So again, the tuition and fees look on par between all the universities, and now it's just a matter of, well, who's attending them and what their population is. And then I did mention in my intro that I was a Pell Grant recipient, so I'm always very curious about that. I actually wrote a paper on HBCUs and Pell Grants. It's published in the Journal of Education Finance, where I dug in and did a lot of research about Pell Grant recipients in the HBCU sector. There's quite a few. A third of US undergraduates receive Pell Grants. That's for all schools, so a third. That doesn't mean they receive full Pell, but they receive some form of it, whether it's average or not average. And then I divided out, well, how much are they really getting? Because again, this is part of the revenue, and if the university is receiving some form of revenue, then maybe it's going to trickle to how the libraries operate, right? So I'm trying to kind of build that case right there. And then state appropriations. I did say that they were declining, but I didn't do a longitudinal analysis here. I'm just giving you a snapshot of 2023 data so I can meet my time frame. But you can see that state appropriations for HBCUs is much less, significantly less than it is for Hispanic serving institutions. And again, state appropriations are mandated to pay for Medicaid and elementary and secondary education first. Higher education is not a mandatory spend. And then just to present things fairly, and I wondered if I should include this slide, but I did. I have two that I just want you to think through. Let me see if I have some notes on this. Yeah. Okay. First, when we think of regional, or just definitely in the regional, it showed up that more women than men are attending school right now. In the HBCU population, they probably have about a 76% African American student population, people who identify as that. And then the non-HBCUs, so the others, it's only about 14%. So they really are targeting folks that are in unique situations. But I don't want you to think that all HBCUs are predominantly African American, because they're not. There's actually some HBCUs that are predominantly white. So I encourage you to find that out on your own. And I guess I put this up here for a couple different reasons, right? Trying to fund the academically talented, financially challenged student should be a bipartisan issue, right? And what work we do in libraries, in a lot of ways, because we are supporting the student body, could be bipartisan. The president actually, under Doug Jones, who is was a senator in Alabama, passed this Future Act back in 2019. Basically, what that did was to ameliorate the headache of FAFSA filing for students, easing their pathway into school. It increased their access to Pell Grant funding so that they could have a little more help with their tuition and fees. And it provided a permanent mandatory funding stream specifically for HBCUs. It's the first time it happened. And then so that was his first administration, the first Trump administration. But then in this second administration, not even a month ago, he reinstituted some aspects of Title III, which basically added, let me get the exact amount, added to his first administration, added another $435 million per year to HBCUs. So while there are a lot of things that might seem like it should lean heavy one way or lean heavy another, I would just prefer to take a more bipartisan route and look at where the money is really coming from, right? And how you can gain access through different lobbying of legislatures and things like that, right? So in both of these efforts, they were bipartisan. So that was my walk through higher ed and some library finance. Be curious about your thoughts, comments, questions.
Hi, thank you so much.
She's going to put you on mic.
Thank you. Is it on?
I think so.
Okay, great. Oh, yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. I was just wondering about the variability in institution size and student population size, and whether any of this looks different if it's scaled to student population size. I'm in Georgia, and some of our local HBCUs are very small, and I was wondering if that's been something that you've looked at.
I did look at it in the article that I published for the Journal of Education Finance. I don't have that data on hand right now, but yes, I looked at perhaps not population, although it had that bit of a correlation. I based it whether they were a small rural institution, which was based off of population, a medium rural institution, also based off of population, or a large rural institution. And then I also grouped anybody that was urban and suburban so that you could really see how the geography played out. That's great because that is a big factor across any of your institutions, right? Whatever your FTE is and where you are located is going to affect that level of funding. Yes. The same could be said, actually, if you cut up your flagships, right? So if you just think about it in your head, like, who's one of the flagships that are going to spend the most amount of money? It's going to be probably University of Michigan, right? They're deep with their endowments. They're going to spend so much more than a flagship in the South, right? It's just almost in some ways not comparable. And so it's important to take a look at the geolocation and the level of the population that you're dealing with. That was a great question. Yes?
I don't know if this was available in the data you looked at, but, oh, sorry.
Yeah, we got to get it on mic.
Sorry about that. Did you look into or see anything about staffing in libraries related to this data and seeing how funding or spending compared in relation to the amount of staff in the libraries of these institutions?
Yes, there wasn't a lot of staffing for any of these institutions. I think maybe on average, I don't want to misspeak. I think we were only looking at, I might have looked at like 8. So the regionals might have had as many as 8 librarians as reported in IPEDS. And I skipped the all staffing, but I did look at students. And so they might have had as many as 15 students. But then you'd see that smaller sector might have only had like 3 or 4 students and maybe only 3 or 4 librarians. So that does play a part as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is really interesting data, so thanks for talking about it today. I'm curious also about the collections and looking at the FTE tiering of institutions, coming from a flagship institution, my resources cost way more for 60,000 FTE than it does. And so there's, I'm just curious if you looked at how the FTE would impact the cost per, how far your dollar can go.
No, I think that's really good. I didn't specifically look at that, but that's a really good point. And I think that draws back to my question on, well, how much consortial support do we get if we can bundle with a bunch of other schools like the Big Ten Alliance or GWILA or ASERL or whomever, right, where we can kind of come in as a group. We might have more purchasing power at a flagship level, even though it's for 60,000 students, versus a regional who might only have 10,000 students, but they don't have anyone else at the bargaining table with them, and they don't have any chips to bargain. That's a great question. I should take notes and follow up. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you all. I really appreciate that you came. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was what you were expecting.